So I'm charged with this unambitious title, Science-Informed Decision-Making. And I think, actually, Stuart, you gave that title to me, if I'm not mistaken, so in some sense I'm not responsible for it. Let me say a couple of words about my background. First of all, I'm by training a natural scientist, and I worked and still work in environmental science, looking at human impacts on ecosystems. I also work in biomedical science, looking at developing cancer therapeutics, particularly viral cancer therapeutics. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about today actually has not much to do with either of those areas, but more to do with an exercise that I was involved in a few years ago, where I was asked by the National Judicial Institute of Canada to provide a manual for judges to interpret scientific evidence in the courtroom. And that exercise and a lot of the consultations that we had around that helped me understand, or what I believe to maybe naively understand, a couple of the things about the communication of science and the nature of science itself. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Hopefully with the idea of informing the question. So this was the question that I understand that we were charged with, and I've emphasized the 4 words or phrases in there about which I'm going to talk about. Now, let me disabuse you of a notion. I don't profess to have any expertise in this. I'm going to talk about them anyway. And I'm going to start with this. Probably many of you know this. David Hume, 1739, Treatise on Human Nature. He distinguished between these 2 types of propositions: is propositions and ought propositions. And this distinguishing, even though it's fuzzy in places, I think is very useful, because it tells us a little bit about where science, at least in principle, begins and ends. And I think that's particularly relevant to our discussion about public participation in risk and risk assessment. So Hume pointed out that, of course, there's no logical connection between those 2 things. There's no logical connection between an is proposition and an ought proposition. One is about the way the world is notionally, the other is about the way the world ought to be. So that, to me, constrains where science and scientists have privilege. Their privilege extends to questions of the is variety, but not to the ought variety. They can contribute, of course, to questions of the ought variety, but they are no more privileged than anybody else. And I think that's an important starting point. So one of the things that I've done is, through this analysis that I was doing for the manual for judges, I had the opportunity to review transcripts and judgments of court proceedings. And it gave me the opportunity to decompose proposition statements made by experts, scientific experts. And I realized that embedded in every one of those propositions were implicitly value elements. And it struck me that a useful, at least for me, coming from a position of ignorance largely, was to try and ordinate propositions on a scale from mostly about values to mostly about facts. And that's kind of an interesting, and this is probably not novel at all, it struck me as kind of an interesting tool, because it then, if you do that, go through that exercise, then you kind of get a feel, at least qualitatively, for how much of the proposition is actually about science and how much of it is not. And that seems to me to be a useful finding or tool. And when I talk to scientists about this, there's this naivety among scientists that, or this illusion, probably many of you are familiar with it, that science has very little of the value in it. And when I teach biostatistics, I teach courses in biostatistics, and I point out that in biostatistics we're concerned with testing so-called null hypotheses. And we decide at the end of the day whether to accept or reject those hypotheses, those null hypotheses, which I've labeled here as H0. So in this matrix, there's 2 types of errors, type 1 error and type 2 error. And in science, we have adopted by convention, in statistical hypothesis testing that we're going to make type 1 error very small. So we set type 1 error equal to 0.05. The consequence of that is type 2 error goes up because those two are negatively related. And the question is, why have we set the type 1? First of all, why have we prioritized type 1 error? And secondly, why have we set it at 0.05? And there's no science in the world that can inform that question. This is a purely value judgment. So embedded in the actual guts, the operational guts of doing science, there's this critical value element, which most scientists don't really give a lot of thought to. What do I mean by evidence? Well, in the courtroom at least, evidence, and I think generally the perception of evidence, is it changes one's belief in a proposition. So given evidence, if you have some measure of belief in a proposition with and without the evidence, if that evidence changes that belief, then it's evidence. Notice that the proposition need not be a scientific proposition. Science is concerned with scientific propositions. But there are all sorts of other propositions, and therefore all sorts of other evidence, which can change people's belief. So when we talk about science, and this is going back to that ordination, relevant science, or relevant evidence, is that which changes our belief in a scientific proposition. We acknowledge that there are all sorts of propositions which are not scientific, fall outside the purview of science, and therefore we acknowledge that there's all sorts of other evidence that changes people's belief in those propositions, but it's not scientific evidence. Okay, I've been involved in all sorts of risk assessments. That's the technical aspects on drugs, on chemicals, on infrastructure. And it's interesting that all of those assessments don't start off with the most fundamental question, which is how we define risk. Risk to what, and by what? And thirdly, how do we determine acceptable risk? In risk-based decision making, all three of these are crucial. Everybody knows risk, convolution of exposure and hazard. Why? There's no science. This is a construct. This is a normative construct. There's no science that could tell us that that's the way we should define risk. And arguably, we could define it where we weight exposure and hazard different ways. Again, this is a decision that lies outside science. But that's a fundamental question. We do risk assessment assuming that the first representation of risk is the correct one. But there's all sorts of other alternative and equally legitimate representations. So here's a question, the fundamental question in risk assessment, where there's a whole bunch of non-science. Risk to what? Right? Things that people value. Risks created by what? Things about which people are concerned. Both of these issues, fundamental in the risk assessment process, largely lie outside science. Science can inform them, possibly, but science is by no means in a privileged position. Acceptable risk. Right? Just the very notion of acceptable risk implies it's all about values. Right? It's about the costs and the benefits, your perception, one's perception of the costs and benefits associated with particular actions, which link inextricably to your values. So the point that I wanted to make here is that in the risk assessment process, there are all of these elements that have actually very little to do with science, and certainly for which science is not in a privileged position to pass judgment on, or even to render an informed opinion. So what I've done here is I've kind of deconstructed the risk assessment process, and I've colored it, and this is, don't read too much in the quantitative nature of the color, but I just kind of colored those various elements of the risk assessment process by my perception of how much of the issue in that particular step is about science and how much of it is about non-science. And the thing that you will notice is that there's a lot of green there. And in fact, the red is a very small technical middle part of the process. Once you've defined the values, once you've defined the assessment endpoints, once you've defined the potential threats or stressors about which one is concerned, once you've defined how you're going to operationalize risk, then the science comes to bear. So all of those other processes in there, all those other hugely critical steps, there's a lot of non-science. And so my answer to the question, and again, let's be clear, this is not an area that I know very much about, and there's been a bunch of things talked about today that I know very little. But I would say that if you want to embed public participation, the publics generally in risk assessment, there's an obvious, in fact, a critical place for them to be. One, at the front end, in defining risk, in defining the endpoints about which we were concerned, the values, defining the potential concerns, stressors we would call them. At the end, notions of acceptability. And throughout the process, something we've alluded to before today, this whole notion of kind of transparent and open communication. Thank you.